Hello, Agutin. Let's go over a little bit this Maamar Podoh Beis. Can move on. There's only an overview, and there's much more to be covered, more than the little what we're going to cover now, what we're going to discuss now. What I just want to do now is to outline a little bit the Maamar, just to get a general direction where the Maamar is headed, what the Maamar is trying to explain, and how it explains that. Just to go through the Seder Dvorim in the Maamar. So, really, you could say that the Maamar is a little bit split between the first three Seifim and from Sif Daled and on. The first three Seifim is dealing with one part of the pasuk, one issue, so say one shaila, one issue, and from Sif Daled and on is developing another point, another nekuda, which that's what it just continues discussing for that whole long arichas. So it goes like follows. So Sif Aleph right away starts to be magdir, to define what is this milchamo that we're speaking about in this pasuk. The pasuk, בשלום nafshi mikravli, Hashem redeemed my neshama, my nefesh, from my milchamis, krav is milchamis, kiviram hayimadi. So what's this mikrav? What exactly is this milchama which we are discussing? So it explains right away that real milchama is pshah, that you're trying to conquer the other person should be your opponent, should be completely enveloped in you and become one with you. So the only way to do that is if you're actually dealing with him hands-on, if you're actually involved in hands-on combat. And that's the mikrav, milchama, which has the connotation, the word we use for milchama is a word which connotates kiruv, connotates closeness, because that's how you actually wage such a war. And you want to really get the war to its finish, get the war to be fully won, the enemy should be included in you. That has to come through mikrav, that's to come through being involved with him in a very hands-on, one-on-one combat all the way. So that's the mikrav chelik of the pasuk. Now, what Sif Beis goes into what's the Bishalom. What does Shalom mean? And that you could say Sif Beis kind of puts it in three shlavim, three things. The classic beer of Shalom, the classic avodah, which Maamar discuss, which connected with peace, with Shalom, is Torah. Why Torah? It doesn't really discuss it so much here. The idea being that Torah just tells you the emes the way it is. It doesn't necessarily go into the issues and the challenges which are connected with klipes, with Elam Hazah, with Lumazah. It just tells you what the Ratzon Hashem is, and Mela everything becomes Nichol and Ratzon Hashem. So Torah is very much a view from above, telling you the truth the way it is. Not dealing so much with trying to schlep out the menagid and try to make over the menagid in his territory. So the Maamar goes a little bit more. So here we're not really as much discussing, at least at this point, we're not discussing that aspect of Torah so much. Here we get into within tefillah, where the whole point of tefillah is to try to take b'ma'or midas and to speak to your nesh bahamis. You're trying to daven in a pnimis ha'ofen, so that itself could be in several ways. A person thinks about the greatness of Hashem in such a way that the Nesh Bahamis can understand it, so that's milchama. You're waging war with him. You're trying to conquer him, get his feelings involved. His feelings which were previously involved with other things should now be involved with Kedusha. However, when a person davens, not with his, the way the Maamar says, nefesh ruach neshama, not with his, necessarily with his seichel, with his midas, which are directed and speaking the language of the Nesh Bahamis, but rather trying to awaken what it calls, at first, it discusses the idea of chaya. Chaya means a person's ratzin, his nefesh kiss has a strong desire to serve Hashem, which this desire is overpowering, this desire is above limitation, is not necessarily limited by his understandings, by his feelings. That is more a menucha, that's more a shalom type of effect on Nesh Bahamis, because the idea here is that you're not trying to get into Nesh Bahamis' mode of understanding. You're not fighting with Nesh Bahamis. You're telling Nesh Bahamis that this is what I want. Nesh Bahamis wants very, very much to serve Hashem, to do what Hashem wants, and you're completely not Iman Da'omar. You're telling that you completely mervatel, you run over Nesh Bahamis through the power and through the toikef, through the strong ratzon that the Nesh Bahamis has. So that's a certain idea, a certain aspect of shalom, of menucha, and that you're not struggling, you're not fighting with the Nesh Bahamis on his level. More accurately, real menucha, real shalom, the Maamar explains that's the idea of yichida. Why? Because with chaya, it's a war, it's a struggle of power, a struggle of ratzonis. Whose ratzon is more strong? Is it ratzon nefesh bahamis or ratzon nefesh l'kis? And eventually, at the end of the day, nefesh l'kis is the stronger one and cancels and overrides nefesh bahamis. However, yichida doesn't have that discussion. Nefesh bahamis doesn't have a yichida. Nefesh bahamis only has a til chaya, only has a til ratzon. Yichida is something which is unique to nefesh l'kis. So nefesh l'kis tells Nefesh Bahamis, shows Nefesh Bahamis its Yechida power, then the Nefesh Bahamis has nothing what to answer. There's no opposition. There's no opponent here whatsoever. And here in this way, in this sense, in this type of Avodas Hashem, Nefesh Bahamis is completely cancelled to begin with, doesn't have any ability to express itself, to stand up against, to show any type of opposition. So this is this full idea of Shalom, of Menucha. In that, you don't have to struggle, you don't have to deal directly with Nefesh Bahamis with its issues, with it on its level. It's just you're showing a certain truth that Nefesh L'kis has, and Nefesh Bahamis becomes included and overpowered completely. So now the question, after the Maamar goes through these shlavim, goes through these like levels of menucha, and defines that it pinpoints that the real menucha, real shalom is really when a person serves Hashem with his yichida. That sets up the question of the Maamar, that once we're speaking about yichida, it l'chayr completely negates any concept of milchama. Now, in the pasuk Poshalom nafshi nikravli ki b'rabim ha'yimadi, the Mitzvah Rebbe explains that b'rabim ha'yimadi goes on yichida. B'rabim ha'yimadi means a person uses his yichida in his avodas Hashem. If that's so how is the whole first part of the pasuk apply? What are you having a b'diah from? What do you need to be redeemed from? A person tapped into a part of himself where there is no opposition. There is nothing of the Nefesh Bahamis which can stand up against the Yechida Fayid. And furthermore, there's no b'diah and there's also no krav. There should be no milchama. There should be complete shalom. L'chayra. The way the Maamar sets it up, even if a person he's just using nefesh ruach neshama, even if a person is just convincing his Nefesh Bahamis with very seichelic and normal asbaris, telling Nefesh Bahamis it's worthwhile for him to serve Hashem, and Nefesh Bahamis Taki agrees, at least for a little bit, while he davens, his Nefesh Bahamis is so to say asleep. Even then, at that point, there's no milchama. At that point, he's good. At that point, he doesn't need to be redeemed from anything. Kolshkin, when we're speaking about chaya, and Kolshkin, when we're speaking about yichida, when we're speaking about such levels in a person's neshama, which completely overpowers Nefesh Bahamis, doesn't deal with him whatsoever, doesn't even let him express himself in any way, shape, or form, then that's l'choira, that overrides, that completely negates any concept of milchama, any concept of a need for a pediya. That's the question. And the Maamar answers this question already in Sif Gimel. Maamar explains that a chidush, an interesting way of looking at the idea of kibbutz ha'yimadi, that we don't actually mean a person that has gilui ha'yichida. It doesn't mean a person that experiences and feels yichida, like a person that would be actually going on Mesiras Nefesh. It means a person thinks about the fact that he has a yichida, and he would go on Mesiras Nefesh. And the fact that I have a yichida, it's machayiv me, it obligates that I should act accordingly. I should try to make every part of my life act according to what my yichida demands. So in other words, you can have a person who's actually on a low level. You can actually be a person which actually has milchamas. He actually has struggles. He actually has issues with Nefesh Bahamis, and that's not going away anywhere because his yichida is not actually shining. He's not actually in power, but because he remembers the fact that he has a yichida, that would help him in the Parashal Nashim Mikravli. So until now, first three sifim is just defining what does it mean kibbutz ha'yimadi in this pasuk. In other words, it's trying to establish the fact that there's a b'ram ha'yimadi, the fact that there's a yichida does not negate, is not necessarily a stira to the fact that a person could still need to be redeemed. He still has struggles. He still has an Nefesh Bahamis. He still has what to be put against. Because kibbutz ha'yimadi doesn't mean a gili yichida, means to act accordingly with what yichida would demand. Now from Sif Dalet to the end, it goes to the whole it focuses on the first part of the pasuk, on a different. It goes on a different angle. It speaks about the idea of Podoh v'shalom nafshi mikravli. How again do you connect? How do you combine? How do you have together in one person idea of milchama and idea of shalom working together? So to preface, the Maamar goes into an idea based on another place, another concept, another pasuk. What it says by Yaakov Avinu, he said, "V'shavti v'shalom el beis avi." After going down, after being involved with love and with all the struggles that she's involved, it says he returned b'shalom to his father's house. B'shalom explains. It explains what it means. What does it mean b'shalom? That completing his avodah, bringing back whatever he was mavayir, bringing back whatever he elevated, was done in a shalom way, in a way of shalom. And that Gufa explains that there's beis shalom, bis shalom. There's two types of shalom which Yaakov Avinu used, and that's what he had to say for himself. That's what he came back with at the end of his avodah with love. Now the Maamar goes and explain that what does it mean two types of shalom. The Maamar explains that there's two ways how a person deals with birurim. There's two ways how a person elevates and refines ilm hazeh or a klipa or whatever it is, a tachten. There's two ways. What it explains is milmayla mata and milmata lamayla, and each one of them has a maila over the other one, and both of them are necessary. That's what the Maamar. That's what the Maamar is going. Will explain. That's also the idea of Podoh b'shalom. The same idea. There's two shalom. There's two concepts of shalom. That there's two types of birurim, and we're trying to use both of them, and eventually, as the Maamar explained, to combine the two. So it explains like this. It depends at what you're looking at. In other words, if a person's trying to really negate his neshama amis and make sure the neshama amis will never bother him again, he really wants to get rid of it, so he needs to go into the avodah, what's called birur milmayla lamata. Birur milmayla lamata, again, is basically similar to what we said before. Dear birur milmayla lamata is that a person is not being goyres his neshama amis. He's not trying to get into the neshama amis's little struggles and trying to convince the neshama amis to love the Eibishter. He overpowers the neshama amis. He's showing the neshama amis an experience, an which is completely beyond it, completely higher than it, and that cancels, that mevatel neshama amis completely, and the neshama amis can never again raise its head, can never again come back against the person. That's birur milmayla lamata, and has a very big advantage in the fact that whatever you do then it lasts. He spoke to the neshama amis in such a way that the neshama amis can never raise itself again. However, he didn't actually deal with the neshama amis. Here it was a point that the nefesh l'kis was shining. The nefesh l'kis is being powerful, being strong, and the neshama amis is shut down. Really, there's an advantage, there's a maila in the other way, milmat l'mayla. Milmat l'mayla means the nefesh l'kis explains that neshama amis, it's worthwhile for him to search for Hashem, to want Hashem, to want Elikus. When nefesh l'kis explains that to the neshama amis, so here it's yesh bezeh mashim bezeh. No, here it's exactly the opposite. Here there's a big maila, the fact that something which previously just wanted the opposite of the Eibishter, just wanted gashmias, just wanted ilm hazeh, now is convinced and now desires godliness. You made something actually change. You changed something from what it was before to something new. However, this change is very limited. You didn't cancel neshama amis. You convinced it in one aspect to be different. In other words, that the neshama amis remains a neshama amis. It remains in play. It remains where it is. It's still a tachten. It still wants taivas. It still desires things. You happen to convince it in one aspect, in one point, to that Elikus is worthwhile. But it could always come back again. You could always get convinced otherwise, convinced the other way, and it'll be back to square one. So there's a maila in milmayla mata, and the fact that you're mevatel neshama amis. There's a maila that you change the neshama amis. However, the change is a limited one. It's not absolute. It's not complete. while in the Maamar Podoh it would be more a complete bittul. Now, so you have your two oilmas, two things. In other words, that how much Malmat L'mayla is usually a Melchama idea, here in a certain sense there is a shalom, there is a certain menucha which you get out of it. The fact that you take over, you accomplish something which Malmat can't accomplish. So the idea is that each one of the two have what the other one doesn't have. Each one of the two has its own advantage. Now, so Maamar explains that you need to have both. You need both. You need both Mailat and Matl to use each one for its milas. You need the milas of each one. And the Maamar continues more that in reality it's not just enough to have two separate types of avodah. Avodah where you're mevatel hashbahamis, avodah where you change it hashbahamis, but in each one you have to have the other one. You have to each avodah has to include the mile and shleim the other one has to offer. In other words, when a person is take shining or if neshul lekis and trying to mevatel hashbahamis, there has to be involved also a certain tnua, a certain approach that you're also speaking to Nefesh Bahamis. And the same thing the other way. A person struggling with Nefesh Bahamis to convince it, there also has to be a certain hechakite, a certain reimus, a certain emeskite, so to say, if you could say, that the Nefesh Lekis, the Mamayel Mata has to offer. There has to be a combination of both. Now, how does that work? That the Maamar explains later in Sif Ches and Tes. So far, we're explaining Sif Daled Hey Vav, which is explaining the two types of birurim. The mile in each one, how each one has what the other one doesn't have to have, and ultimately you have to have both of them together, sai both of them at the same time, and sai a combination of both. Now, another point that says in Sivav, which ties back to what we already said at the end of Siv Gimel, is that the way our person taka combines opposites of, again, changing Nefesh Bahamis or mevatel Nefesh Bahamis is through the koyach of Yechida. And again, as we explained before, the Yechida here doesn't necessarily mean that person actually by him is shining Yechida. It means that he has a certain, as we said before, he has a certain approach, a certain idea of bittul which is in his head, which he remembers, and that itself enables him that he has this combination of both. But that's how, again, the Maamar goes from Siv Gimel to Siv Dal Hivav. Again, Ibrahim Hayimadi is the way which leads to Podoh V'Shalom Nafshi Mikravli, which that Podoh V'Shalom Nafshi Mikravli, as we're going to explain, is the connection of these two ideas of changing and mevatel hashbahamis. Now, Siv Zayin, the Maamar takes a bit of a break. In other words, it's the same. It ties it into this idea, but it goes a little bit on a tangent, a little bit on discuss another concept, which the Fidige brought in the Chasna, the idea of Chol B'naich Limudei Havai Rav Shalom B'noich. The Fidige explains that what we're looking for, we're trying to do, is that should be Chol B'naich Limudei Havai, that even when a person is learning with his own seichel, he's learning Torah, he has to understand the Eibish's Torah. And when he understands the Eibish's Torah, he has to have bittul talikus. When he's learning, then the Torah will accomplish shalom. The Torah will make a idea of peace in the world, peace with him and all the people. And it explains in the Maamar that if not, if a person doesn't have that bittul, so it causes the opposite. It causes Peter Dalavavis. Explains there a whole arichis. When a person is just thinking about himself and not thinking about the Eibush, not thinking about the Lukus, it causes him to feel that he's the center of everything, and anything is going on is all against him. And it brings a famous smaisa how there's once a person who's he's a bar das godel naskola. He came to Tzarech Tzedek. I told Tzarech Tzedek that he feels that people are stepping on him in the base medrash. People are not respecting him. And Tzarech Tzedek told him that if you're mispashed in the whole base medrash, so obviously wherever people are going to step is only going to be on you. Where that itself, the Rebbe points out a few very gishmak and nekudis, how he's saying you have here a person that is going into Yechidus, and the whole point of Yechidus is that's a kesher of his Yechidus to the Rebbe, to whom he's going into, and even there he's just thinking about himself, about his own yeshus, about his own self. All this comes because he didn't have that avodah. You're only a bar das gaskola, and Mela it says there the Fidige fears that people have, just like a person has to go away from Averis, he also has to go away from the strength of his machshavos. A person has to leave his machshavos of yeshus, and the way the Rebbe explains, not just machshava, but machshavos, any level of yeshus, at any level, any lack of bittul, any madrega, a person has to get rid of that. And if a person has bittul, then he's able to have both tastes of shalom, side the shalom of Torah, and side the shalom of tefillah, side mil ma'il mata and side mil mata l'mayla. Now the Rebbe explains l'choira. We're trying to, the whole context of the Fidik Rebbe. He's trying to explain We're trying to explain how limud Torah should be with bittul. Why is he bringing here avodas tefillah all of a sudden? So that the Rebbe explains, based on what we said before, that when there's taka real bittul comes from yichida, then that taka enables that there should be a connection, that in Torah should be the mile of tefillah, and in tefillah should be the mile of Torah. We're trying to connect the two ideas of mil mile mata and mata l'mayla. That's how the Rebbe connects this whole concept, this whole arichas we just said, back to what we were discussing before, how we're trying to connect these two miles, the shleimus of mile mata l'mayla. Fine. So now back, the mind goes back in Sif Tes. That was Sif Zayin. Now in Ches and Tes, the mind goes back to Taka explain how Taka could you have a combination of two seemingly opposite things, either being mavatal, canceling Nashmamis, or changing Nashmamis. It explains like this, that really everything which is created in the world is for the purpose of being elevated, for the purpose of being brought into Kedusha. All nitzutzis, all sparks which exist Lamato, are all here for that purpose. So automatically it means that not only are they not a steer to that, they want that. Every single thing in the world wants to be elevated, wants to be closer to Hashem. Now the problem is that being in Galus, it's not evident. We can't see this. We look at things in the world, we see we don't see how they want to be close to Hashem. So for that, the only way to change that comes to the Avodah of Hayid. When Hayid is in the Gala, his Yichida, when Hayid brings out this essential point of Yichidish Menefesh, so then he's able to, he sees the world, and the world is able to perceive the truth and from a completely different side, from completely through different lenses. That you start to see the emes. That's not just that you're affecting the world by putting into something which is strange from it, something which is outside of it. You're trying to bring out how really the truth of every single thing in the world is that it wants to be elevated, it wants to be raised. So the idea is that that's how it is. How it's by the nitzutzis. Like every single spark that exists in the world really wants to be elevated. That's how it is by every single person. And that's how we explain Podoh Nafshi Mikravli, how you can have a combination of the two milas of Milmaila Mata and Milmata L'Mayla. And it explains that everything. What we said before was that there's a stira. The two things don't fit together. If you're mivatalim the nashmamis, you're not speaking to the nashmamis. You're mivatalim. You're telling them that I'm stronger than you. I'm overpowering you. I'm putting you down. But the vort is that if the nashmamis itself wants to be nisbayer, wants to be elevated, if you're showing whatever you're trying to elevate that it's your ratzin, so then it's a completely different story. By me showing you my nefesh l'kis, I'm not putting to you something which is outside of you, something which is putting you down. I'm showing you what you actually want. I'm showing you who you really are. So even when you're being oising an avodah from L'mayla Mata, of like limud Torah or Chay or Yechida, these things, there's also because the person has Yechida, that also it also lifts with that you're trying to elevate, which is not neshmamis in this case. Also the other way, when a person, why if a person is trying to convince neshmamis that the lekus is gishmak, does he lack the breakite and the bittul that there is involved in Milmayla Mato? Looks again, he's trying to convince neshmamis to do something which is not it. He's trying to convince neshmamis that even though you like gashmis, you like the world, you should also want elikus. Elikus is also gishmak thing. So that's bamedvar amurim, when we're not showing that neshmamis that you yourself want to be elevated. But if you tell neshmamis that this what I'm convincing you is this is what you want, so he stops viewing it as being convinced from the outside. It's him being himself. So Mela, it doesn't leave any space in neshmamis to later come back and oppose again, as we said, that would have been the chisar of Milmata L'Mayla, because here this is side change in neshmamis, and side doing it in such a way that it's not shaykh to return. It's not shaykh to be in any way different. That's the idea of Yechida. That's what Yechida can accomplish. The Maamar connects us to Yaakov Avinu. Again, Yaakov Avinu said, "V'shat Beis Avi v'Havaya Lila Ekim." Havaya Ekim is a connection of Soivim Amale. Again, the idea connection of something which is overpowering, bligvul, and something which is channeled and mugbal. That again through Yaakov, with the idea of Nachal Bli Mitzarim, his idea was being, he represented Yechida, be able to combine Havaya Ekim, combine Soivim Amale, which that's really the whole purpose of why we're in the world, to be Miachid Kush B'Chush Shchinte. The Maamar ends. Again, this in Sefiyud, the Maamar ends that the same thing when Mashiach, with Mashiach is the Yechida of all the Yidden, of everyone. When Mashiach is here, he combines, he makes a shalim, makes a connection between the Eibishter and Yidden, again in the most complete oifen, as we said before, not just that there is one overpowering the other, one convincing the other, but rather there's the miles of both working together, a mile of a chibur, a mile and a mile.